All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning share, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Shvat, Haba Lino Latova, Mel and Karen Ram, for dedicating all of the shiurim this month in honor of the entire Chabura, Shir, Kihila, and Halavach Lashbrach, who should give us the opportunity to learn together, to grow together for many years to come. We'll say with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Chaf Vav, and we are picking up on Chaf Hebes. Where did we leave off yesterday? Otzi Anies Halan. Where's that on the page? Perfect. Good. I know we got down a little bit. Let's begin. Ela Amar of Chista, which is I think right around where we left off. 2 lines up from before it gets wide. Ela Amar of Chista, Lo Kashya. Ha Rabbi Eliezer, Ha Rabbanan. So the Gemara says, so Rav Chisda comes along and says, there's no contradiction. Rather, it's reflecting 2 different opinions, Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan. To which the Gemara says, Eman Desham say the Rabbi Eliezer the Meratza Tzit Alachilos. So again, remember the Lokanis Mishamislei. So the Gemara says, I understand the position of Rabbi Eliezer that we saw in yesterday's daf. That Rabbi Eliezer says that Halacha Lamaisa, that the tzitz is meratza on tuma so as to allow for achila. The Lokanis, who's to say that there's no penalty involved if a person does something b'mezid, mishamislei, to which the Gemara says, the same way that we understood this position for Rabbi Yossi, we also understood for Rabbi Eliezer. The Sanya, Bryce says as follows, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, both a third wide line in the bottom. Bein b'shogig, bein b'mezid, trumasa truma. So remember again about saying in the truma case, whether you did this b'mezid or b'shogig, this was the case of separating out tame produce separating out tame produce as truma for tahar produce. So Rabbi Eliezer says as follows: whether you did this b'shogig or b'mezid, truma so truma, your truma is effective. To which the Gemara says, "Ema deshamas le Rabbi Eliezer b'truma tequila." That works fine according to Rabbi Eliezer by truma, because truma in general is treated in a more lenient fashion. Bekachim dechamiri mishamisle, but by kachim ultimately again, which is a bit more stringent. Do we find that statement? Imkain ha aman tarmi. If that's the case, who do we attribute this braysa to? So Ravina Amar Tumaso bin b'shogeg bin b'hortza bin b'mezid hortza. So ultimately, again, so Ravina says that right when in the case of tuma, whether it's b'shogeg or whether it's b'mezid, the tzitz affects atonement. Zrikaso b'shogeg hortza b'mezid lo hortza. In the case of zrika, where zrika was done in a state of tuma, ultimately, again, if it was done b'shogeg, it works. B'mezid, it does not work. For Rav Shila says, Zrikaso bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid hortza. Rav Shila says, when it comes to zrika, whether it's done b'shogeg or b'mezid, it works. Tumaso b'shogeg hortza, b'mezid lo hortza. By tuma, if it's b'shogeg, it works. B'mezid, it won't. Or Rav Shila, hadig tani shenitma bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid. So again, according to Rav Shila, when it says whether the tuma occurred, whether it's b'shogeg or b'mezid, this is what it means to say. Nitma b'shogeg, if a person went ahead and did something in a state of tuma b'shogeg, or zarko bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid, or zrika will be effective whether it was done b'shogeg or b'mezid. Incredible. Top of Chavav 26a. So tashma dam shenitma b'zarko. If dam became tamei, but zrika was done anyway, b'shogeg hortza, b'mezid lo hortza. If it was done b'shogeg, it works. B'mezid, it will not work. Kachikam, that's what it means to say, dam shenitma v'zarko, if dam became tamei and zrika was done, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid. It's effective whether it was done b'shogeg or b'mezid. Nitma, if however, again, it became tamei, b'shogeg hortza, b'mezid lo hortza. Ultimately, again, b'shogeg it will be effective, but b'mezid it will not be effective. So I will say that closes out this sugya over here about tuma. So remember again, let's go back. What's the ikar halacha l'maisa for us? The ikar takeaway from us, at least for our Maseches Menachos purposes, is that the tzitz is meratza in a case of where the kmitza became tamei. That right, because again, in general, the tzitz affects atonement for karbanos offered up in a state of tumah, and therefore halacha l'maisa, if the komets became tamei at some point and was offered up nevertheless, it is still effective, counts towards the owner's obligation for the tzitz affects atonement. Incredible. Then we went through the whole limit about how that works. Beautiful. Mishnah Chaf Vav Amadav 26. A really interesting case. Nitmo shiareha, nisrafu shiareha, avdu shiareha. So Rosh says, listen to this. What happens now? Up beforehand, we were speaking about if something happens to the kmitza. In this case over here, what happens if something occurs to the shirayim? To the shirayim. So the shirayim were burns, the shirayim were lost, or the shirayim became tamei, were burnt or were lost. So in other words, kmitza was fine, something happened to the shirayim. So the Gemara says, kamidas Rabbi Eliezer kshera, or kamidas Rabbi Yeshua psula. So the Gemara says, literally again, in accordance with the position of Rabbi Eliezer, it's kasher. According to Yeshua's pasul. What are these positions? Look at Rashi for just a moment. Actually, very interesting. So Rashi says over here, Kamidas Rabbi Eliezer, Da'amar b'para ketzad solin dam afa pi she'ein basar. So remember again, it was that we saw this machlokes. It was actually quoting over the Gemara Menachos Pesachim, but it was actually referenced in Zvachim as well, which is that what happens if you have a karban and you have the blood, but something happens to the meat. Rabbi Eliezer says, halacha l'maisa, that even if you don't have the sacrifice, if something happens to the sacrificial meat, as long as the blood could be sprinkled, you're good to go. The carbon is effective. He would therefore hold the same position over here. By carbon mincha, as long as you have the kmitza, even if you don't have the shirayim, right, the leftover part of the mincha, you are good to go. On the other hand, Rabbi Yeshua says, im ein basar ein dam. Rabbi Yeshua says, in order for the blood to be effective, the sacrificial meat has to be intact. And if something happens to the sacrificial meat, even if you sprinkle the blood, it will not be effective. So all the Gemara is suggesting over here is the same machlokes that occurs by a karban, that applies by is the same machlokes that occurs by a karban mincha. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, who hold that if something happens to the sacrificial meat, as long as the blood is intact, you could do zrika and the karban is good, would hold that as long as the komets is good, even if something happens to the shirayim, the mincha is still good. Conversely, Rabbi Yeshua, who holds that in order for a karban to be effective, it's not just enough to have the blood, you have to have the sacrificial meat, would agree that it is not enough just to have the kmitza, you also must have the shirayim. Okay, incredible. Amarav, so Rav said, V'hu shenitmu kol shiareha. So Rav says like this, and according to Rabbi Yeshua, who holds that if something happens to the shirayim, the mincha is pasul, that is only if something happens to all the shirayim. So, for example, only if all of the shirayim became tameim. However, aval mikzas shiareha lo. But interestingly enough, it sounds like if something only happened to some of the shirayim, but let's say you still have some shirayim which are intact, that the karban would be effective, right? Then even Rabbi Yeshua, who holds that if something happens to the shirayim, the mincha is not good. That's only if something happens, all of the shirayim become tameim. But if some of the shirayim are salvaged, the karban is good. Because we thought nitma'in avad v'saraf lo, because I would have thought as follows, that is dafka in a case of tumah, where Rabbi Yoshua says that shirayim are psulim, but avad or saraf lo, but not necessarily if they're lost or burnt. The Gemara says, well, 1 second, my kasavar, I don't understand, what does that mean? I kasavar shiura milsihi, if you hold that having any amount of leftover shirayim is effective, then afilu avad v'saraf nami, then Allah chalamaysa, even if it was avad v'saraf, even if halacha l'maisa, some of it was lost or destroyed, right? Even if it was lost or destroyed, should be a problem. Ikasavar shiur lav milsihi, if you hold that leftover shirayim is not effective, then the Gemara says, nitma my taima. So ultimately, even if it becomes tamei, why should it be good? To which the Gemara says, remember, so tumah is different. Why is tumah different? Dimiratze tzitz. Because remember again, we have the tzitz, and the tzitz is able to affect atonement in cases of tumah. If that's the case that the tzitz is effective, then even if you lose, or not lose, even if all of the shirayim become tameim, the mincha should still be good. To which the Gemara says, the olam kasavar shiura milsi. In reality, we hold that having even some leftover of the shirayim is meaningful. V'nitma b'huadin la'avad v'sarif. And you're right. This is not a unique halacha by nitma. It applies ultimately again to whether the shirayim become tameim, whether they're incinerated, whether they're lost. first wide line on 26a, Chav Vav Amud Aleph. V'hai di ka'amar nitma reishaihu nakat. And the only reason it's bringing down nitma is why? Because that was the first thing mentioned in the Mishnah. But wherever it says nitma, it applies to all the other cases as well. Kidisanya Rabbi Shmuel Silber says, Kol hazvachim shebatorah shenishtayir mehen kizayis basar o kizayis chelev zorek es hadam. Listen to this. What says we learned. Rabbi Shua says any carbon where you have. We actually just had this not long ago. Any carbon where you have at least a kizayis of sacrificial meat or a kizayis of chelev that allows you to sprinkle the blood. So I will say this is Rabbi Yeshua that we quoted in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yeshua says in order to do zrika, you must have at least a kizayis of sacrificial material intact, sacrificial meat or chelev. Kichatzi zayis basar, kichatzi zayis chelev. In a zorek es adam. But if you only have a half a kizayis of meat or half a kizayis of blood, that doesn't enable you to do zrika. The exception is an ola. By an ola, if you have half a kizayis of meat and half a kizayis of chelev, they can combine to form the requisite shear. Why? Because everything is being burnt on the mizbeach anyway. And by mincha, even if the whole amount is intact, you can't do zrika. So before we get to that strange last statement, so this is the position of Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua holds, literally again, the lashon of the Gemara is, in ein basar, ein dam. Which means, in order to do zrika, you must have at least a kizayis of sacrificial meat intact. Now again, that could be sacrificial meat, that could be sacrificial chelev, right? You can't have a half a kizayis of both combined, but there's got to be some level of sacrificial material intact in order to do zrika. The only time meat and chelev can combine is by an olah, since it's all going to be burnt on the mizbeach anyway. The problem now is that last statement. And by mincha, even if all of it is intact, you can't do zrika. The Gemara says mincha, they will say we are on Chav Vav Amud Aleph 26a, 5 lines into the wide lines. Mincha, my avidite. What are you talking about? Mincha. What does mincha have to do with zrika? Amar Papa, minchas nesachim. No. We're talking about over minchas nesachim. So I remember again, minchas nesachim is a mincha that can be brought as an accompaniment to a carbon. Now watch this. What happens if you have a carbon, and let's say there is no carbonic meat, but the carbon's mincha is still intact? Does the existence of the carbon's mincha allow you to continue to do zrika? We had this before. I would have thought, I would have thought that because this mincha comes along with the carbon, it is considered to be part of the carbon itself. Kamashmalon, no. Kamashmalon, that according to Rabbi Yoshua, you must have sacrificial meat in existence in order to do zrika, and the accompanying mincha does not count. So the Gemara says, Minhani Mili, from where do we know this? Amar Rav Yochanan, Mishra Rabbi Shmuel, Umatu ba Mishum Rabbi Shua ben Chananya, Amar Kra. So where do we know this from? Now again, I will say, now where do we know what from? Where do we know that according to Rabbi Yoshua, this concept that in ein basar ein dam, that in order to do zrika, you must have leftover sacrificial meat. From where do we know this? So the Gemara says, Minhani Mili, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mishra Rabbi Shmuel, Umata ba Mishra Rabbi Shua ben Chananya, Amar Kra, v'hiktir ha'chelev l'reach nichoach la'Hashem. The pasuk says, you shall offer up the chelev as a pleasing aroma to Hashem. Chelev v'afal pi she'ein basar. So I know this, that as long as there's chelev, even if there's not meat, because remember again, Rabbi Yeshua says it could be a kizayis of chelev or a kizayis ultimately again of meat, but you got to have a kizayis of something. Chelev v'afal pi she'ein basar. So again, you could even have chelev. So either a kizayis of meat, a kizayis of chelev, will be enough to allow you to do this rika. The Gemara says, so I understand chelev. Yoseres ushtei klayos minalan. From where do I know that this applies ultimately? Yoseres is the diaphragm, right? The diaphragm, the kidneys. How do I know that that's enough? In other words, that even if you have those items left over, that's enough sacrificial material so as to allow for zrika. Diktani ubemincha. Because again, what did the Brisa say? Even if you have the entire mincha intact, you can't do zrika. Mincha hu lo yizrok. It's only the libational mincha that is not enough to allow you to do zrika. However, ha yoseres ushtei klayos Yisrok, but ultimately again, but we see from here that, but the Gemara says, and how do I know that halacha l'maisa again, that if you have the osaris, the diaphragm, and the kidneys, that is enough to do zrika? Rabbi Yochanan didei amar the reach nichoach. Rabbi Yochanan himself says, because the pasuk says, a pleasing aroma, kol sha'ata ma'ala l'reach nichoach, anything that is offered up as a reach nichoach will allow you to sprinkle blood. And therefore, again, since the diaphragm and the kidneys, the oseres and the shtei klayos are offered up and they provide reach nichoach, therefore their presence ultimately again allows for the zrika. And you need both. Why? You need chelev and reach nichoach. Because of chelev, had it just said chelev, have amina chelev in your oseres shtei klayos lo. I would have thought it's stop chelev. But other sacrificial pieces like the kidneys or like the diaphragm would not allow for zrika. Therefore, again, kasev rachmana reach nichoach. The kasev rachmana reach nichoach hava amina afilu mincha. And if it would say the reach nichoach, I would have said that applies even for mincha. Kasev rachmana chelev. Therefore, the pasuk says ultimately again chelev. So we'll say. So bottom line, what's the takeaway? So first of all, the Rambam Paskin is like Rabbi Eliezer. Let's go back to mincha. So we have a general machlokes, right? The general machlokes is: do you need sacrificial material in order to go ahead and continue on in the carbonic process? So by regular carbonos, that's a machlokes. Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Eliezer says dam afal pi she'ein basar, that you could do zrika even if there is no intact sacrificial meat. Right? You don't need the sacrificial meat. Rabbi Yeshua says, im ein basar ein dam. You must have at least the kizayis, the sacrificial meat in existence in order to go ahead and do zrika. The Mishnah applies that same machlokes to mincha. Right? Something happened to the shirayim. Can you go ahead and proceed with the burning of the kamitza? Rabbi Eliezer says yes. Rabbi Yeshua says no. Interestingly enough, the Rambam Paskins like Rabbi Eliezer by mincha. So by mincha, even if something happens to the shirayim, I don't know, they became tamei, they become lost, they're incinerated, you can proceed with the burning of the mincha. Yet interestingly enough, halacha l'maisa, the Rambam Paskins like Rabbi Yoshua by karbanos. So by karbanos, in order to proceed with zrika, you need at least a kizayis of sacrificial meat. Now, that can be a kizayis sacrificial meat. That can be a kizayis of sacrificial chelev. That can be a kizayis of kidneys, diaphragms, right? All these other beautiful zachin, right? Or by an ola, it can be a combination of both chelev and basar, since everything is going to be burnt, everything's going to go on the mizbeach, but you do need kizayis of sacrificial material in order to continue. Incredible. Mishnah. Shelo b'kli sharis pasel. So here we go. Very interesting case here. Let's say Rashi says shelo b'kli sharis, shelo kiddush kometz b'kli sharis, de b'chilas mincha badei lo pligi de b'kli. So remember again. Process from mincha. You have a kli sharis. Step 1. Step 2, you put the oil in. After the oil, you introduce the flour, right? Then you go ahead and mix it up, introduce more oil. Then you take the kamitza. The shaila now is, does that kamitza have to see? Interestingly enough, the way the process normally works is that kamitza is then put into another kli sharis and taken to the mizbeach. The shaila is, if you skip that second kli sharis, let's say you didn't put the kamitza in a kli sharis, so does that invalidate the mincha process or not? That's our case. Shelo b'kli sharis, right? If you did not put the kamitza into a kli sharis, pasel. Tanakama says the mincha is pasel. That kamitza needs to go into a kli sharis, and failure to do so invalidates the mincha. Rabbi Shimon machshir. Rabbi Shimon says ultimately, no, the carbon is going to be kosher. Hiktir kumtza pa'amayim kshera. What happens, Rabbi say, if you didn't burn the kamitza at once, instead you burn the kamitza in 2 stages. So in other words, imagine you take the kamitza, you put a little bit on the mizbeach, take a break, then put the other part of the mizbeach. So the Mishnah says that is kosher. Okay, let's analyze. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Breid Rav Chia, my time is Rabbi Shimon. What did Rabbi say? So fundamental machlokes in the Mishnah. You failed to put the kamitza in a kli sharis. So Tanakama says mincha is pasal. Rabbi Shimon says mincha is kosher. So says the Gemara, Rabbi Shimon, what's your logic? What's your logic that the mincha is going to be kosher? Amakra kodesh kadoshimi kachatos ukeashim. The pasuk says the mincha. The mincha is kodesh kadoshim. It is holy of holies. kichatos u'ka'asham. So the Gemara says, ba la'ovda biyad, ovda biyad and kichatos, if you are going to do it by hand. I'm going to say, what does by hand mean? If you're just going to take that kamitza and just go right to the mizbeach, right? You're not putting it in a klisharis, okay, then you manage it like you manage a chatos. How is the chatos managed? The zrika is done with the right hand. So too you should apply that kamitza with the right hand. Bikli, but if you're going to put the kamitza in a klisharis and take that kli over to the mizbeach for the application of the kamitza like that, then ovda b'smol ka'asham, then you can even go ahead and take it in your left hand like an asham. Now, I will say, what does that mean in your left hand like an asham? If you look at Rashi, Rashi's 2 lines up from before it gets wide. Rashi says, "Bismol ka'asham shezrikasa b'kli." Now, I will say, interestingly enough, the blood application of a chatas is done with your finger, specifically the right finger. With an asham, interestingly enough, the sacrificial blood is in a kli, and the blood is applied with the kli. It doesn't have to be applied with your hand. So because of that, Rashi says, the only carbon that requires the blood application with your finger is a chatos. Everything else could have the blood, thrown onto the mizbeach or sprinkled onto the mizbeach, ultimately again with a kli. Now, interestingly enough, the halacha is that with a kli, even if you're holding it in your left hand, it's still kosher. Still kosher. So we'll say, so look what Rabbi Yoshua did. The Torah, when speaking about a mincha, compares the mincha to a chatos and to an asham. Why? Rabbi Yoshua says very specifically to teach you that there are 2 ways in which you could bring the kamitza to the mizbeach. What are the 2 ways? You can either take the kamitza right from the kli, right, do the kamitza from the kli sharis, and bring it right to the mizbeach. And if you do that without putting it into a second kli sharis, you need to do that with your right hand, like a chatos. Alternatively, you could take the kamitza, put it into a kli, and then take the kli to the mizbeach and essentially pour the contents and pour the kamitza onto the mizbeach. If you do that, you could do that even with your left hand, like an asham, because the asham, you could take the blood that is in the kli and apply it to the mizbeach even with your left hand. What do you see from here? That the use of a second kli shares for the kamitza is optional. And this is the position of Rabbi Yoshua. Incredible. Rabbi Yana says, "Kevan shekamsu mikli sharis malio maktira afilo beheimayno va'afilo b'makida shel cheres." Rabbi Yana says, once you do the kamitza ultimately from a kli sharis, a second kli sharis is absolutely unequivocally unnecessary, and you could even put the kamitza literally again in your belt or in an earthenware utensil and bring it to the mizbeach like that. Very interesting. Rav Nachman says that everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa, a kamitza must be placed into a kli sharis. Now, how could he say that everyone agrees that the kamitza has to be put in a kli sharis? Didn't Rabbi Yoshua just disagree with that? Look at Rashi for just a moment. Second Y line in Rashi. Hakol modim b'komesh aton kiddush v'chi machshir Rabbi Shimon behekter shemnot lo mitoch kli sharis la'achar shekitcha bo velo biyado v'ktiro kasher. So what Rabbi Shimon means is like this. Or generally, the way you would offer up the kamitza is you would take the kamitza from the kli sharis, place it in another kli sharis, and then take that to the mizbeach. So ultimately, again, what Rabbi Shimon is being machshir is, then you would take the kli sharis and kind of empty it onto the mizbeach. Rabbi Shimon is saying is, if you took the contents of the second kli sharis by hand and applied it to the mizbeach, that would be kosher. Very interesting novel interpretation of Rabbi Shimon. Basically, listen to this. So this is our fundamental machlokes. Well, now it's more than a two-way machlokes. It's an interpretational machlokes as well. The bottom line machlokes for our purposes, aside from that last position, is does the kamitza need to be placed in a kli sharis or not? When you take the kamitza, can you just run that? Can you just take that over to the mizbeach and burn it like that? Or no, as part of the avoda, taking the kamitza and putting it in a second kli sharis as well. That is the fundamental machlokes. The Gemara says meisvei. The Gemara raises the kasha hekter chalavim ve'ivarim ve'eitzim shelan be'miyad be'makli. Listen to this. When it comes to the burning of fats, or sacrificial limbs, or wood, eitzim, that you took, shehelan bein biyad bein makli, that you brought them to the mizbeach, whether you're doing it by hand or with a kli, bein biyamin bein bismol, whether you did it with your right hand or your left hand, kshirin, ultimately, again, it is kosher. Hakometz v'aktores v'halavona shelem b'miyah b'mikli. But if you took the kmitza or the ketores or lavona that you took by hand or by kli, bein biyamin, bein bismol, ksherin, whether you did it with your right hand or your left hand, ultimately, again, it's going to be kosher. To which the Gemara says, Tiyufta Rabbi Yehuda Breid Rabbi Chia. So this is a refutation, ultimately, again, of the position of Rabbi Yehuda. God bless you. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Breid Rabbi Chia, Litztadin Katani. So Rabbi Yehuda Breid Rabbi Chia says you have to interpret this in two places. I should say in two ways. Litztadin means in two ways. Biyamin, biyad, if you're going to head and take the kmitza by hand, meaning you're going to take the kmitza, not put it in a kli sharis, just put it on the mizbeach, biyamin. You have to do that with your right hand. Bikli, if you're going to use a utensil, bein biyamin, bein bismol. Ultimately, again, you could do that with your right or with your left hand. Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda successfully reinterprets the brisa, ultimately, again, to be in accordance with his position. Incredible. Okay, fine. Tashma. Kamso shalom kli sharis. Listen to this. If you did kmitza, not from a kli sharis, the kid show shalom kli sharis, and then you were makadesh the kmitza, not in a kli sharis as well. Vehelo vektiru shalom kli sharis. You took it to the mizbeach without a kli sharis as well. Puzzle. So you know, that's a pretty straightforward case because in this case you didn't use a kli sharis in any stage of the process. Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon, machshirin b'matan kli. Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Shimon, ultimately again, they are machshir even without the use of a kli. All right, so the Gemara says, Ima. So first of all, both say that sounds a little bit extreme because that sounds like you don't need a kli sharis at all. Ema mimatan kli ve'elech. No. What it means is like this. That halacha l'maisa, maybe for Rashi says over here, for halacha naktara, maybe in other words, the kmitza has to be sanctified ultimately again in a kli sharis. Perhaps halacha l'maisa, the kmitza has to be put into a kli sharis, but perhaps for the act of taking it to the mizbeach and for burning it, it doesn't need a kli sharis. That in other words, from that point in on, even if you want to handle it by hand, that would work. Incredible. So the Gemara says as follows. Tashma, the Chum say, Kometz ta'on kli sharis. The Chum say that no, kmitza requires a kli sharis, to which the Gemara says, Keitzad, komtzo mekli sharis, umekatsha bekli sharis, umaleo umaktiro bekli sharis. So listen to this. So this brisa is more extreme. This brisa says the Chacham, what do you do with the kmitza? The kmitza must be taken from a kli sharis, which means, again, remember, that's where the flour oil mixture has to be in a kli sharis, and the kmitza removed from the kli sharis. Umekatsha bekli sharis, you have to sanctify it in a kli sharis. Umale umaktiro bekli sharis, and ultimately you have to offer it up in a kli sharis. You take it to the mizbeach in a kli sharis as well. So according to the Chacham Rabbi say every stage of the process has to be done with a kli sharis. Rabbi Shimon says, Kevan shekamtso mikli sharis, malo maktiro shelo bekli sharis v'dayo. Rabbi Shimon says the kmitza has to be taken from a kli sharis. Ultimately, again, the kmitza should be placed in a kli sharis, but from that point in on, you could take it to the mizbeach and offer it up, and you don't need a kli sharis. The Gemara says, "Ema kevan shekamtso v'kidsho bekli sharis, malo umaktiro v'dayo." Perhaps ultimately, what means to be stated over here is once the kmitza was consecrated, right? Once the kmitza, kevan shekamtso v'kidsho bekli, which sounds like once the kmitza was taken from a kli sharis and placed in a kli sharis, the rest of the process need not be done with a kli sharis. Okay, so we'll say, so fundamental machlokes over here, which parts ultimately, again, of this process do we require ultimately, again, a kli sharis? So let's analyze a bit more. Tashma, kamatz biyamin b'nasan bismolo, yachzir liyamino. So listen to this. So if you did the kmitza with your right hand, but then put the kmitza in your left hand, you need to put the kmitza back in your right hand. Bismolo abasei amud beis. If you have it in your left hand, chaf amud beis 26b. Bismolo v'chishav aleha. So we'll say, let's say the kmitza is in your left hand, and when it's in your left hand, you have a disqualifying mindset. For example, v'chishav aleha bein chutz limkomo bein chutz lizmano, and then you had a disqualifying mindset, either to do it outside of its permitted place, right, chutz limkomo, or outside of its permitted time, pigol. What's the halacha? Puzzle ve'in bo kares. Ultimately, again, the carbon is going to be puzzle. The carbon is going to be puzzle, but there is no kares. Now the Shita Mikubetzes changes this last part over here. It says, Biyamino chishev aleha. If ultimately when holding the kmitza in your right hand, chishev aleha chutzlim kamo puzzle ve'in bo kares, right? You have in mind to go ahead and let's say consume it or do something with it outside of the permitted time, it's puzzle, but there's no kares. Chutz lizmano, if you have in mind to do something outside of its permitted time, pigol v'chayav and alav kares div Rabbi Lazar. Ultimately, again, it's going to be pigol, and you are chayiv kares for this. These are the words of Rabbi Lazar. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon Chacham say, Kevan shenasno the small paslasa matnasa. It's very interesting. The Chacham and Rabbi Shimon say, once you go ahead and you place that kmitza in your left hand, you've disqualified the kmitza. Very interesting. Once you've transferred that over to your left hand, the whole process is shut down and it's going to be possible. What's the reason for that? My taimo mishum debay kedusha bekli. Ultimately, again, the reason would seem to be because the kmitza itself doesn't go into the left hand. Where should the kmitza be? Where does the kmitza go? The kmitza requires consecration or sanctification in a utensil. The chayva shenasnal the small, and once you place it into your left hand, naaseh kedam shenishbach min savra behema ala ritzba va'aso shepasal. When you place the kmitza in your left hand, that's no different than shechting the animal, the blood spurting. Yeah, right. The blood pouring, right? The blood spilling right onto the floor and ultimately being recollected. Most remember that from our Zvachim days. Then what's the halacha? If sacrificial blood spills on the floor and then you recollect it, that is possible. So interestingly, the Gemara wants to suggest the act of taking a kmitza from your right hand and putting it into your left hand is no different than sacrificial blood pouring on the floor and then recollecting it into a kli, which is going to be possible. Now, Michlal, I will say from this conversation we could infer Michlal to Rabbi Shimon lo ba'u matun kli. I will say from this conversation it would appear that Rabbi Lazar and Shimon do not require the placement of a kmitza into a kli, to which the Gemara says, you're right, that is definitely the inference to Yufta, Rav Nachman to Yufta. This would therefore effectively refute the position of Rav Nachman. So the Rabbi Yehuda Breit Rav Chia Misayele, but yet it does support the position of Rabbi Yehuda Breit Rav Chia, which is how we started this whole sugya. Rabbi Yanai Lema Tehevet Yufta. For Rabbi Yanai, it should also refute his position. Rabbi Yanai Ana the Amri Kitana the hekter belav litzadim katani. So he says, I hold like the Tana of the Brisa of hekter of the burning of the items, and ultimately again I do not see it as two separate cases. Okay, so Rabbi say. So bottom line, this is an incredibly important sugya. So what do we do with this? So first of all, say this is important procedurally, right? Because the shaila over here, right, remember, all of this really distills to one simple shaila, which is, what do you do with the kmitza after you take it, right? We've been hyper-focused on the taking of this kmitza. I'm the Kohen, I've got the kmitza in my hand. What do I do with it now? So listen to this. So the Rambam Paskin, the Rambam says over here, this is in Parak Yud Aleph of Psulah Mukdashin, Halacha Vav. Halacha Vav. So the Rambam says as follows. He says, good. He says over here, Haisa hamincha shalo b'kli shares, o shahaisa kumsa shalo b'kli shares, o she'alu b'lemizbech shalo b'kli shares, o she'bala shmana b'chutz la'azara, psula. As I was saying, in all of these cases, the halacha is you need a kli shares for every single one of these cases, right? So halacha l'maisa. So the Rambam says like this. Good. So what I want to point out is like this. So the Rambam says, what do you need a kli sharis for? A kli sharis is necessary for the oil and the flour. So initial stage of placing oil and flour together. Ultimately, again, mincha, you need a kli sharis. Next, ultimately, again, shahaisa kumsa shal b'kli sharis. The mincha itself, ultimately again, the kmitza has to be put into a kli sharis as well, right? So step one, that the mincha itself has to be created in the kli sharis, that's step one, right? Step two, that the kmitza itself has to be placed in a kli sharis. The Rambam Paskins, those are the indispensable parts of this process. Right? So step one, that the kmitza must be taken from a kli sharis, and step two, that the kmitza must be placed in a kli sharis. That's The Rambam then paskins, right? The Rambam then paskins that helas akomitz amincha biyad o bekli chol, helas akomitz bekli sharis v'zarko le'esh v'zviach biyad kasha. So we'll say the rest of these processes, ultimately, again, if you did it without a kli sharis, it is going to be okay. Which means, if you then transport it to the mizbech, you take it from the, right? So remember again, step one, that the mincha itself is created in a kli sharis and the kmitza is taken from a kli sharis, need it. Step two, that the kmitza itself needs to be placed in a kli sharis. After that, the use of a kli sharis is optional. What does that mean? If you want to take the kmitza from kli sharis number 2 and walk that over to the mizbeach and put it on the mizbeach like that, totally fine. Or you want to walk it over in the kli sharis, but then take the contents from the kli sharis and put it on the mizbeach yourself, that's fine. So what we call holacha and haktara does not need a kli sharis. But the creation of the initial mincha, the removal of the kmitza, and the placement of a kmitza and a kli sharis are all the indispensable parts of this process. Good. That's the halacha l'maisa. Right there. Says the Gemara. 2 dots. 2 dots. Right? Oh, sorry. Wrong page. Wrong page. Good. So the Gemara says, Hekter kumsa pamaim ksher. So then the Mishnah said, if you go ahead and you offer up the kmitza in 2 stages, the mincha is going to be kasha. So we'll say, so whereas a simple case, a straightforward case is, you're taking the kmitza, what are you doing? You're putting it all in the mizbeach at once. If you were to go ahead and divide up the kmitza into 2 parts, offer part of it, then offer a second part of it, halacha l'maisa, the mincha is still kasha. Rabbi Shmuel Levi, pamayim v'lo pa'amei pamayim. This isn't it supposed to say. Rabbi Shmuel Levi says, you could offer the mincha in 2 parts, but not any more than 2 parts. Right? Not any more than 2 parts. Literally, pamayim v'lo pa'amei pamayim. Okay. Rashi says, you can split it up into 2, but not more than 2. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, Rabbi Yochanan says, no, you can do it even as many times as you want. In other words, you can essentially, once you're putting it on the mizbeach, you want to put a little bit now, a little bit now, a little bit now. You want to divide it up into 15 parts, not a problem. So what's the machlokes? What's the machlokes over here? On Rabbi Zera, Yesh komets pachos mishnei zeisim v'yishaktar b'chusim mekizayis igabenez. So let's listen to this. It's a fundamental machlokes, ultimately again in the size, ultimately of a kmitza, and ultimately in the amount that is burned. Listen to this. Rabbi Shmuel Levi passes. Rabbi Shmuel Levi says, "Ein komets pachos mishnei zeisim." Ultimately, again, a kmitza is not going to be any less than 2 zeisim. And therefore, again, if you take the kmitza and you divide it into 2, at least every kmitza is going to be 1 kizayis. Ve'inaktara pachusa mekizayis. Rabbi Yochanan says, Yesh komitz pachos mishnei zeisim. No, you could have kmitza that's even less than 2 kizayim. Ve'ishaktara pachusa mekizayis. You could have aktara burning that is less than a kizayis. And therefore, even if you divide it up into smaller parts, it's totally fine. Okay, so we'll say, so ultimately, again, the way that Rambam paskins is like Rabbi Yochanan, that really, if you end up burning the kmitza a little bit at a time on the mizbeach, the kmitza is still fun. And it doesn't matter how many pieces you divide it up, which again, the logic being is it's all considered to be one halachic act of burning. Itmar, komets, matir shirayim. So this is a very interesting case. At what point in time in the burning of the komets are the shirayim permitted? I will say, now remember again, the way things work with a classic mincha is how you burn the kmitza, and the leftover part of the mincha now becomes permitted. Now is permitted. So Rabbi says, so halacha l'maisa, the Gemara is asking, at what point in time in the burning of the kmitza, in other words, how much has to be burnt? What has to be burnt in order for the shrine to become mutter? Rabbi Chanina says, mishamashla bo es ha'ar. So Rabbi Chanina says, as soon as the fire takes hold of part of the kmitza, already again the shirayim are permitted. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, mishetatzitz bo es ha'or berubo. It's not just enough for the fire to take hold on part of the kmitza. Rather, the fire must take hold on the majority of the kmitza. Then and only then are the shirayim permitted to be consumed. Amalei Rav Yehuda, l'Rabba bar Rabbi Yitzchak, asar v'l'chatam Rabbi Yochanan. Let me explain to you the logic of Rabbi Yochanan. Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, v'hinei Allah kitor haaretz ki kitor hakivshan. So we'll say this is by stone. Interesting, by the destruction of stone. So the pasuk says that literally again, v'hine Allah kitor haaretz, like smoke, right? The burning of the land rose like the smoke of a furnace. Now listen to this. Now both say, now why are they quoting this pasuk over here? Because the way that the Torah is referring ultimately again to the burning is kitor, haktara, the same lashon ultimately again by karban mincha. Ein kivshan malakitor achetatas barsa abarubo. When does a furnace produce smoke? Only when the fire has taken hold of the majority of the material that is being burned. So what do you see from here? The definition of haktorah is when the majority of the item has been ignited. And then Rabbi Yochanan says that the shirayim only become permitted after halacha l'maisa, the fire has taken hold over the majority of the kmitza. Amrei Rabbi Baravad l'Rava, Amri Talmidcha, Amrei Rabbi Baravad l'Rava, Amri Talmidcha, Amar Rav Amram. Tanya ainli eladvarim shedarkan likarev balayla. So this is only true ultimately again regarding things that are offered up at night. What is this? We're going to define what this means in just a moment. Kigon evarim upedarim shema'alon umaktir mevo hashemesh. So this applies to things that are offered up at night, like evarim pedarim, which literally means the sacrificial limbs, the sacrificial fats. So ultimately, again, we'll say, you know what? Actually, we're going to pause over here for just a moment. Pause here. I'll just share with you a short idea in the parasha, because this, again, the sugya goes on for a little bit. So I will say, but suffice it to say, we left off in the midst of a raging machlokes over here, which is halacha l'maisa, how much of the ketores, how much of the kmitza has to be burning in order for the shirayim to be permitted. So Rabbi Chanina says, as long as the fire takes hold of part of it, you're good to go. Rabbi Yochanan says, the fire has to take hold of the majority of it. Halacha l'maisa Mirat Hashem will be resolved tomorrow. So we'll say, quick vart. Parshas Yisro. So the Torah says, Vayishma Yisro. Yisro heard everything that happened to Klal Yisrael, and ultimately he came to join the Jewish people. Rashi HaKadosh asks a very simple question. Rashi says, Ma Shmua Shama Uba. What did Yisro hear that made him join Klal Yisrael? Asks the Heilige Piyazetzna. The Rebbe says, I don't understand. What do you mean, Ma Shmua Shama Uba? What did Yisro hear that made him join Klal Yisrael? The pasuk says that Yisro heard everything that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did for Klal Yisrael, that he took us out of Mitzrayim, Kriyas Yamsuf. So what is Rashi asking? Ma Shmua Shama Uba. Seems to be such an obvious question. The Torah says Yisro heard everything that happened to Klal Yisrael, and therefore he came and he joined Klal Yisrael. What's the question of Rashi? So the Piyazetzna says something so beautiful. He says that Rashi's shaila is like this. Yisro heard all of these things, but Yisro obviously was intrigued. He was intrigued. So Yisro is the Shver. Yisro is Moshe Rabbeinu's father-in-law. Let him go ahead and send a message to Moshe saying, Moshe, you Jews are very interesting. I'd love to learn more about you. Can you dispatch a melamed, right? Dispatch someone over here, right, to where I'm going, to Midyan. Let me learn a little bit. Let me understand a little bit. Let me grow a little bit. And let me see what this is all about. But interestingly enough, that's not what Yisro did. Yisro saw that something amazing was occurring. And what did he do? He uprooted himself. He left his life, at least for some amount of significant time, and he went to join Klal Yisrael. Because Yisro understood that there are times in life where something dramatic happens and you need to move yourself forward. It is not enough to go on with life as usual. Something dramatic has to change. Says the Piyazetzna, that's Rashi's question. Ma Shmua Shama Uba. It's on Uba. What did Yisro hear that motivated him to change his life, to move, to go, to just shift things around? Why not just say, send me someone to teach me about Judaism, send me someone to teach me Torah? But Yisro understood that there was something so dramatic underfoot that his life had to change in some way. Mashmu Shama Uba. That's what Rashi is marveling at. How does the high priest of Midyan leave his entire life behind and join Klal Yisrael? What motivated him to get up and move? That's what Rashi is intrigued by, and says the Piyazetzna something so amazing. He says, in life, there are moments of inspiration. And in those moments of inspiration, we have to make a critical decision, which is stay in place or act and move myself. And so often what happens in moments of inspiration is I'm inspired, and then we saw that this last night a little bit, and then I don't move myself. I don't do anything with that inspiration. There's no uba. When things happen in life, good or difficult, those are wake-up calls to do something different. It doesn't have to be as dramatic from Yisro to move to a different place. But it does mean when something dramatic happens, how am I moving my life? What's going to change? Because if it's just business as usual, no matter what happens, then the inspiration comes and the inspiration goes. Yisro teaches us something absolutely amazing, that when there is inspiration in life, you have to have your uba moment. You have to have that moment where now something shifts, something changes, something adapts in a different way. Like I always quote Rabbi Shmuel Silber, right? What does the Rebbe say? The Rebbe says, when you have a moment of inspiration, what should you do? What should you do? Open up a chumash and learn a pasuk. Why? Because at least do something with it. Do something with that inspiration. Because unchanneled inspiration simply dissipates into the spiritual oblivion. But when we have those moments of spiritual wokeness, don't misunderstand that concept, right? Right? When you have that, right? When you have that moment of spiritual awakening, like Yisro Uba, take it and do something with it. Make sure that inspiration allows my life to be different going forward. Don't settle back into your midyan. But when you find those moments of spiritual awakening, make sure somehow, some way, life is different going forward. Good Shabbos. What a week together. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a great Shabbos, everyone.